For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Human rights lawyer Charles Abrams joins me to discuss his book titled Class Action in Pursuit of a Larger Life. So this memoir is based on the class action lawsuits you spearheaded to defend the vulnerable and the oppressed. Can you tell us how class action lawsuits work and why you developed an interest in them?
Thank you so much, Sani. In fact, the book is titled Class Action. It is about, the lawsuits, the class action lawsuits, but in fact it is much more. It is a memoir. It is a memoir about my life, about my own journey from childhood into my young teens, young adult, into my adulthood, and then my professional life. And that entire journey, my life story, provided the basis, the ammunition for the class actions. And that was, in fact, it was the impetus for, the class actions that I've undertaken. So it actually started, or it arose out of my experience as a child, growing up. I was born in the late 60s, to be exact 1967, and it was a time of brutal oppression, so under apartheid. I know what forced removals were about because my family were forcefully removed. And so all of that, together with a whole host of other aspects that I have experienced, provided the basis for, ultimately the class actions that I would, undertake many, many years later.
You are also telling a story that gave me mixed emotions about why you didn't pursue a dream of being a heart surgeon. Can you briefly share that story?
So that's a very interesting one, and I think that that's probably where quite a bit started if one looks at it, looking back and you want to connect the dots. So there was this moment when I was 12 years old, and I was just full of excitement when our school teacher told us that the inspector was coming to visit, and he wanted to know what people wanted, we as children wanted to be one day. And by then my mother had told me this wonderful story of this heart surgeon, Dr. Chris Barnard, who had performed the world's first heart transplant. I was so captivated by this story that I'd said to myself, one day I'm going to be that heart surgeon. And I couldn't wait, for this day, when the inspector had ultimately come to the school, because I wanted to share it not only with him but with the class and so on. And so, everyone that went before me, they wanted to be school teachers, truck drivers, policemen, and so on. And I wanted to be. And I got up. I had scruffy little, shirt, and oversized, short pants. And I got up and I, said, "Sir, I, want to be a heart surgeon." And there was this moment in the class where everyone just went dead quiet. And they asked me to repeat that again. And I thought, well, they didn't hear properly. And I said, "I want to be this heart surgeon." And just almost unanimously, everyone broke, into uncontrollable laughter, in class. Only to find that the inspector and the school teacher themselves were having an absolute ball of a time laughing. I just couldn't understand. And after the laughter had subsided, he came over to me, looked me up and down, and then he asked me where I was from, and I explained that I was from the street called Brimway, and people, the pupils in the class laughed again. And then he said afterwards, "That's very fine, but don't aim too high." I didn't understand that, and it was tough. It touched the deep emotion inside of me. And so what happened, very interesting, 5-6 years later, it would make sense, that experience, when again I had an encounter at school where I was brutally assaulted by a teacher together with a group of other teachers. We were having fun in the class, and because of the noise, etc., we were assaulted. And that, it caused an uproar at school, and people from in the community came around, and there was one particular person that come around, and he was a very, serious political activist, and he put that incident together with the incident that happened many, many years earlier when I was 12. He put it into perspective. And what he basically said was that what you have experienced is exactly what the aim of Bantu education was about. It was to destroy that in what they call the African child, the black child. If you can destroy that at an early age, okay? You can destroy the dreams, you can destroy the hopes, all of it. Then effectively what you would have, you will be secured of having, a workforce eventually whose only task would be to perform manual labor, who wouldn't have to think too much. And that's essentially the message that he conveyed.
You grew up in a poor community in Neugedag, which you hated. What was it like growing up in the area, and how did it contribute to you choosing this career?
So yeah, I was about 5 years old when we moved to Neugedag. And prior to that, I was born and grew up in a place called Elsies River, but in a shack, in an informal settlement, what is commonly now known as squatter or informal settlements. And that was my home. But when my father came home and he broke the news that we were going to move to Neugedag, and then there was a term that I didn't understand at the time, to a colored area. The only thing that I could think of is colorful. And I thought that this must be a very colorful place that we're moving to. And so when we ultimately got to Neugedag, and remember that evening when we got to our new house, it was just an immaculate experience, wonderful. A brick house, it had electricity, it had flushing toilet, all of this. And you can imagine a child at my age never having had that. I ran around with my brother, and so on. But what was very interesting, over time, I started to realize that there was something much more sinister about this place than what I'd initially imagined. In our road, for instance, there were what we call maisonettes, 2-story flats, and just opposite us there were the 4-story flats. And so I couldn't understand why people were housed in flats, and we had a freestanding house. And it later became, it dawned onto me that in fact people came from other places and they were stacked on top of each other. And it was only when my mother and father in time started speaking about this thing of forced removals, and they spoke about it in hushed tones, how people will move from other areas to make way for white people, that I started to realize that there is something fundamentally wrong. But then, when I discovered that other than people being cramped into spaces, when we started to experience the kind of violence in Neugedag that I'd never thought as a child I would experience and be subjected to, that's when it really dawned onto me that Neugedag was a very dreadful and terrible place.
In chapter 10, you wrote about the 1985 protest, which led you not to write your matric exam, and your brother Francois being arrested. Can you briefly tell us about the reason for the mass action?
So now you can imagine, having experienced what Neugedag is about, having experienced the disintegration of a society, having experienced what Bantu Gata education, was about, and that incident at school where I got brutalized and so on. That became almost a turning point, and it was the one that conscientized myself and my brother about what the world around us. But it was a very interesting world because by then we had known as children what had happened a number of years early, almost a decade earlier. And the Soweto uprisings of 1976, and they all, of a sudden, we got thrust into the events of 1985, as young pupils, kids. And it was our moment. And it was the moment when we realized that, look, now more than ever, we needed to make our own voice, our voices as young learners, pupils, heard. We got thrust into the events of 1985. We started to question the very education that we've been subjected to, all the years and so on. And the one thing led to the other, which ultimately resulted in the incarceration of both myself and my brother in 1985. It led to our detention. And it ultimately also led to me not being able to write my school exam, in 1985.
After joining your law degree at the age of 28, you joined the Legal Resources Center, and later you opened your own practice at your parents' house. What kind of cases did you deal with during that time?
So here you can see now the progression, and eventually after all the struggle, I finally managed to, I pursued a law degree. Through all the struggle, I managed to finish. I did my articles with the Legal Resources Center, and immediately thereafter I said, look, I want to open my own law practice. I had only very limited experience, but I was so dedicated and I wanted to do. But that was the moment when I could not choose what it was that I wanted to do. I had to do the cases that had come to my door. And having grown up and lived in one of the most impoverished townships on the Cape Flats, gang infected with all the violence, those were the cases that came to me. But quite, ironically, many of them were my friends. Many of them were we grew up together. We were at school together. And these were, young men accused of the most heinous crimes. Those were the ones I defended in my very first few years.
Some of the cases exposed you to the world of gangsters in Cape Flats. Can you tell us about that?
So that's very interesting. So here you have someone who had now managed to overcome all those obstacles and ultimately was able to establish, qualify as a lawyer and establish his own, practice. And yet he had grown up, amidst, gang warfare. In fact, that's almost most of his childhood life had been defined by that. So I understood, the issues of gangs and, what it was about and so on. But as a lawyer, I got thrust into it beyond what I had known, beyond what I had expected. And it was into a completely different world. It was the world of numbers. And this is where I got, a peep, into the inner workings of gang that I'd never thought, I would.
Charles, you also addressed the issue of abuse in this book. Your mother was abused by your father. What mark did this leave on you?
Well, you can imagine. I think, if I reflect, back, today to what I had seen, this wonderful father of mine, would come home and was quite excited when I was a child, saying that we're moving to this, area. Very loving father. In almost a year or two after, we've moved to the area, flipped so dramatically when I experienced the first time that he brutally assaulted my mother, to the point where I thought that, that evening she was dying. Even today, I can't, fathom exactly why, someone who was such a devoted father,
Even went to church.
highly, very, very religious. In fact, devoted most of his life to the cause of, the poor, particularly poor farmers. And his life's, mission was to convert them to, to Christ, to God and so on. And yet, he had, exhibited, and he had engaged in these atrocities, towards my mother. Something that I could not understand as a child and as a young person. Of course, many years later, it would I then was able to make sense when my brother, who was now much older, etc., then almost did the same to him, and so the tables got turned. My father, my brother, and Francois, my eldest brother, had harbored this hatred, in him as a child, and then that moment came when he said that this was the opportunity, and that day when my father got assaulted and slumped into the very same place where my mother had slumped, let's say 20, 30 years earlier, I then had an opportunity to engage him, and what came out was very sad. The fact that all he had known was also abuse. Abuse at the hands of his own stepfather, abuse at the hands of the world around him, abuse at the hands of his employers, the white employers. That's almost, that's almost all that he had known, the year. And I had vowed, and I said to myself, it was quite clear that I got born into this impoverished family, soaked in violence. And I said to myself, no, the spiral I need to break. I need to break the spiral, because there's no way that I am continuing with this with my family. And I almost throughout the years, and not almost, every time I still have to check myself, so that you don't, not just consciously but unconsciously, exhibit these kinds of, whether it's violence towards women, and so on, that permeates our society, today. And I think a lot has to do with our historical background.
Can you briefly share about your London scholarship and how this wider exposure assisted you in your career?
So I got the opportunity to go to London to spend 3 or 4 months with a group of barristers. It's my first time overseas. Someone coming from the background that I'd come from, never traveled overseas. You can imagine, it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. But it was also the experience that would ultimately be the defining moment for my professional career as a lawyer. I got introduced to some of what I would say some of the greatest lawyers of the 20th century. So one person I would say is called Sir Sidney Kentridge, who'd been key in the treason trial of Nelson Mandela, and he'd defended the Biko, family at the inquest. Then I had, a person such as one of the greatest international lawyers called Elie Louterpacht, and then of course, another, person, one of the other, great, British, barristers who had such a remarkable influence, on my professional life, young professional life at the time, that I had said after that experience, I am going to become an international lawyer, international law lawyer. And after that experience, I came back and I pursued whatever opportunity I could to go to Leiden University. Ultimately, I applied at Leiden University in the Netherlands because that's the home of international law. I finally, got accepted. I got a scholarship, and lo and behold, a scholarship in the name of Nelson Mandela. And I was one of the first, students, to be awarded the scholarship and pursue a master's degree in public international law. That, of course, then took my professional career further to the point of ultimately getting to, the class actions. Because it is through that I got to understand the idea of international law, the idea of human rights, not just in a domestic context, but at an international context. But at the same time, I had been very conscious of the idea of the role that multinational corporations and banks had played during apartheid. And that was my one thing. The fact that after 1994, no one, no corporation had come to the fore and said, this has been our role in propping up the system of apartheid. Okay? None. Okay? We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and those that had gone there, apart from the individuals, all proclaimed their innocence. And yet we know, as a matter of fact, they had bankrolled apartheid. They had provided loans and credit. They'd supported, the government, this apartheid regime, with arms and ammunition, everything to prop it up. And so my idea was that eventually, my idea was that through law and with law, I wanted to ensure that these actors, corporate actors, be held accountable.
And lastly, without giving too much away, can you tell us what other issues you are addressing in this book?
So there are the personal issues, and there are the legal issues. But let's deal with the legal issues quickly. So there are the four key major cases that I have undertaken or been involved with. The apartheid case in the UK, in the US, against multinational corporations and banks. Coming back, there is the case of the bread companies that had colluded to increase the price of bread, through class action that I initiated with clients. We finally managed to establish precedent, class action precedent in South Africa. I was also involved, in the arms deal case as the attorney for Terry Crawford Brown, and we know, that as a matter of public record how that is played out. And then, of course, lastly, it's been the major case against the gold mining industry on behalf of gold miners who had contracted silicosis and tuberculosis, and that resulted in a 5 billion rand settlement. But there are also the very deep personal issues that I explore in the book. First, it's the issue of identity. The fact that at some point in time as a child, I was made to believe that my color was absolutely worthless. The very idea of being black, and despite the difference of trying to cast us as colored and black, the fact of the matter that it was absolutely worthless, and having to work through that in the most challenging way, having to deeply self-reflect. The fact that I myself was a victim of sexual abuse as a child, I deal with that, and how I had to overcome those issues. And then, of course, I deal with the issue of, in many later years, of how, as a young man, being confronted with all of this within the context of sexuality. And so there, there's a part, of the book that I devoted to my experience, in Amsterdam, where I thought that a lot of what has happened, you could almost try and deal with it in the way of, now that you have the freedom, you could have sexual liaison, and you can be in relationship with white women, and you think that all of a sudden becomes a cure, because the more and more you associate and the more and more you're intimate, the more and more you think that you don't have to deal with the issues of the past. Of course, you did wrong, and that for me, as having gone through that experience, has really brought me much more closer to the issue of my own identity. And today I am so happy that I've gone through that experience, because there's absolutely nothing. The mere fact that I'm black, etc., that's fine. But within my blackness, I also realize and know that there is much more in myself and in each of us than what is defined by our skin color, our backgrounds, and so on.
That was Charles Abrams speaking to Polity about his book titled Class Action in Pursuit of a Larger Life.